A clerical error. Course, Xenobiology. Instructor, Professor Ed. Note: the professor's real name is unpronounceable to the majority of sapients, thus a monosyllabic name was chosen at random by his previous institution. Rating, 4. 7/5. Top comment, beware the chalk. Most asked, what's chalk? Most helpful, good luck on the first day, take the bags. Lecture Hall 47 was by far the largest one in the complex. It was a point of pride for Professor Ed, something that he, in his mind, had earned. It also had the dubious honor of possessing a piece of history so archaic that it was shunned by every other professor in the university. A blackboard. Blackboards were, according to the professor, one of the few useful things humanity had provided in the 2 decades post-contact. It's not that his people, or any other people for that matter, were incapable of producing slate and chalk. It's that nobody else clung to such archaic traditions with quite as much vigor. But it was a useful one, and thus it was tolerated, and when he was feeling charitable, it was defended. It helped him single out those students who were meticulous enough to take their own notes instead of relying on digitized lectures and holographic slides. The fact that it gave him projectiles with which to discipline the stupid and the unruly was a completely unintentional and entirely secondary benefit. Professor Ed's exterior mandibles twitched in excitement. It was the first day of the first semester. The heady perfume of innocence and optimism was as infectious as it was omnipresent. Many of the arguably saner custodial staff would claim that the professor simply spent too much time inhaling formaldehyde and cleaning agents, and it had finally gotten to him. Whatever the air quality of Hall 47 may have been, the true source of the professor's glee was his students. He wouldn't waste time covering the syllabus and explaining his expectations. The idiots could read it themselves. Those of them who couldn't or wouldn't had no place being at the best university in the spiral arm, if not the galaxy. He'd go straight for the throat and disabuse them of any notions of complacency, any vestiges of naivety, and any physical or psychological frailty. He hummed, a terrifying sound produced by his species' vocal cords and jaws as he lined up his chalk. The pieces used for writing, pristine and fresh from their boxes, were carefully slotted into styli to prevent premature breaking, while the old ones, used for throwing, were set into 4 distinct piles, one for each manipulator. The doors at the front of the building unlocked, and the sounds of hooves, feet, wings, suction cups, and whatever else the myriad species of the galaxy used for locomotion filled the building, the cacophony of movement only occasionally disrupted by the quiet murmurs of uneasy students seeking directions. He sighed when the humans arrived. Of course, they had arrived together. Of course, they all knew each other, and it was only natural they would be the loudest mammals in the damn building. They weren't a bad race per se. They were just ... insufferably cocky. Sure, they had arrived on the galactic scene with all the subtlety of a supernova, won a war, turned religious fanatics into a fine mist, and were possessed of a few amusing mutations and adaptations, but still, they could at least keep up some pretense of humility. Dr. Ed was amazed that even after 20 years not a single human had been devoured by a skrillat, especially given the number of them that had either tried to pet them or gotten drunk and tried to fight them. It might be that he was underestimating the impact that the Styx firestorms had had on the galaxy, or the mental scars left by St. Urban's guns, but really, it was just a matter of time. The students finally arrived at his hall. The multitude of shapes and forms brought a renewed smile to his face. The tapestry of life was one of the most beautiful sights in the galaxy. And there was no better place to witness it than a university. Every species, every race, every sapient in attendance had to coexist in close proximity without prejudice. At least on paper, anyways. The confusion on the students' faces as they entered the hall was one of the few things which Dr. Ed lived for. A brief moment of levity before his work began. It was a natural for a generation who had grown up rarely holding a stylus. The projectors weren't on. There were no models to reveal the subject of the day there. There weren't even any displays. There was only the blackboard which none of the students had ever seen. Almost none of them, anyways. "Dude, a chalkboard," one human said, elbowing his friend in the ribs, shattering the moment. "Huh? Man, it's like being in Mrs. Brown's class." The first human laughed. The second one laughed with him. Both were deserving targets. Chalk, fired with pinpoint accuracy, hit the two humans in the forehead, shutting them up and motivating them to find their seats. Just like Mrs. Brown. The tall one grinned. "Dude, shut up." The other punched him in the shoulder, a display of violence that granted them a wide berth and ensured the seats around them remained empty. The two humans fell silent under the gaze of a cluster of their professor's eyes, both suddenly interested in brushing the chalk dust on their clothes in silence, while the other students waited in relative sedation for their professor to speak, lest they too suffer a barrage of chalk. So, Professor Ed began letting his gaze wander the hall. Since the humans have drawn attention to themselves, can anyone classify their home world and species? It might be a bit beyond them, but understanding the classification system was part of the reading he required his students to have done before the year began. A student from the third row raised its appendage, the third row, where students eager not to appear too eager sat. "Yes. Homo sapiens, the thinking man, colloquially known as humans, evolved on Earth. A Category 6, Death World." The student proclaimed. Professor Ed regarded the student silently for a moment before directing his eyes to the hall at large. "How many of you also know that Earth is a death world?" Most of the hall, save for the pair of humans sitting off to the side, raised their appendages. "How many of you know that from watching the Terminatus trilogy?" Again, most of the hands, reluctantly, stayed up. "Well, you are all, as is colloquially known." He turned all his eye clusters to the student, who withered away under his glare. "Wrong." He whipped a piece of chalk at the student's head. "If you're going to be pompous, be right. Earth is not classified a death world, and even if it were, it would be a solid Category 3, maybe a 5, if you squint and play with the data, but never, never a Category 6. He paused to survey the assembled students. "Does anyone know what Earth is actually classified as?" A few hesitant students slowly marshaled the courage to speak. "The Earth is a crucible world." A syrinx chirped, wings fluttering to bat away any chalk that might go its way. "Yes." Dr. Ed began writing on the blackboards behind him. "Why are crucible worlds not scaled? Because there was no reason to?" the student ventured. "Correct. Conventional wisdom holds that crucible worlds are too unstable to host sapient life." Now, taking a step back, Dr. Ed continued speaking as his lower two arms began writing on the board behind him. "There is one thing that must be made abundantly clear. Everyone please read, aloud, what is written on the board." The hall was silent for a moment as the professor stepped out of the way. Action movies are not valid sources of information. The walls shook with the voices of hundreds. "Excellent. and the next person to proclaim what they heard in a human action movie as a fundamental law of the universe will cover every blackboard I can find in this martyr-damned cluster with lines. His third and fourth eye clusters trained on the Carlag, who was having a hard time hiding his massive bulk from the professor's predatory gaze. Now, Dr. Ed continued, as though he hadn't just caused the largest species in the galaxy to shrink to half its size. Some of you may be wondering why I'm harping on this, why I'm stressing the importance of nomenclature. It's true that I have a personal stake in this. I am the highest-ranked Death Worlder, with a doctorate from a reputable university. But more importantly, he directed his eyes, all of them, at the two humans who sat in the fourth row. I served alongside the Marshal of Fire aboard the Nautilus during its slaver-hunting campaign in the early 70s. I've seen what happens when sapients regard each other without the bigotry of caste, clade, or species, and... The professor trailed off, shaking his head. Face twitched slightly. I know from painful personal experience what happens when we do, and am also aware of the consequences when otherwise good people look away while our work is exploited. Consequences? One of the Trazeth asked timidly. You mean aside from slavery? Dr. Ed snarled, showing a part of his upper torso that had been disfigured and mangled by the hooks slavers used to control his kind. Aside from treating sapients like animals because of a designation given by some forgotten biologist a millennium ago. Aside from that, you mean, right? He demanded, letting the Trazeth stutter and squirm before waving him to silence. Everyone knew the slave trade existed, and everyone knew that in a galaxy of 250 billion stars and 1 trillion planets, there would always be a dark corner for slavers to hide. But as far as these children of the rich and powerful were concerned, slavery and piracy were a problem for people who wore cheap uniforms and wielded cheaper guns. What did they care about pirates in the trade lanes, or slavers on the fringe when they had private security, personal ships, and never left the core? So, for them it was a shock to stand face to face and be lectured by an ex-slave, especially a chattel slave whose body bore the scars and mangled limbs of years of forced labor. A shock they desperately needed if they wanted to delve into xenobiology and xenopsychology. If they couldn't survive even such a mild shock without suffering a fit of vapors, well, Dr. Ed was not known for tolerating the weak of spirit. Do you know what the marshal asked when he came to the cage? It wasn't comfortable enough to call a cell. I had been left in. Some of his students, the ones who had taken the course planning to pass time, twitched towards the doors. When his men broke open the cages of the others, they tried to kill their would-be rescuers. So thoroughly had my people been reduced, so completely had they been reduced to animals, that as his men broke their cages open, their only thoughts had been to kill. The last thought they had as thinking beings was of revenge, so when they were made into animals, that's the only one that remained. He paused, feeling his eyes roll. A hatred for slavers, a passport, and over time, shared values had brought Dr. Ed closer to his human friends. Chief among them, an irrational hatred for injustice. The only question he asked was if I planned on trying to kill him. I said no, and then he gave me a gun. The rest, where I was from, what level of death world I was born on, where I had been captured, if I was a citizen of a relevant authority. Because yes, I see your skepticism. Some people would have left us on a burning station to die. More students looked ready to bolt as they looked and properly took in his appearance, discomforted by his blinded eyes, his mangled limbs, his torn shoulders. The natural world is brutal, ruthless, and remorseless. Dr. Ed's voice rose for the first time, gaining passion and power as he spoke. For every good person, there is a depraved savage set on making the galaxy colder and darker. For every group of herbivores, there is a predator lurking in the shadows, and everything that has ever lived will die, some brutally. As biologists, you will have to observe this with dispassionate interest and absolute objectivity. As psychologists, you'll often have to do more than observe, and yet remain even more objective. He raised his ruined arm to point at the doors. Anyone disturbed by that can kindly fuck off and join another section. 100 or so left, maybe more, maybe less, probably more. Dr. Ed didn't care. His priority, his concern, his obligation was those that remained, those that would at least try to see the world without blinders or tinted lenses. Some of those who left did so with communicators in hand, ready to call their parents and complain about the quality of the staff. Some left nauseated, unwilling or unable to handle the violent death that was so common in much of the galaxy, a facet of reality that they, as herbivores, had never had to consider as more than an abstract. Some simply realized that Dr. Ed wouldn't suffer indolence or idiocy, and his class might require effort to pass. And some, more than he would have liked, simply would not tolerate being lectured by a Death-Worlder slave. Good. He nodded. Now the rest of this lesson, I will be doing one thing, and one thing only, impressing upon you the importance of our work, and the importance of being thorough, truthful, and objective. Who here is familiar with the history of the Agazid? Shrugs, universal shrugs, which prompted Dr. Ed to mutter a curse, and wish, as he often did in situations like these, that he had a human face. Their fleshy, muscular faces were capable of showing so many degrees of emotion. A clerical error saw them classified as a low or non-sapient B6. Does anyone know the implications of such a classification? Again, there was silence. A low or non-sapient B6 designation means that it was perfectly legal for military units to train against them in live fire exercises. Sir. One of the humans spoke. He knew how to be respectful, at least. This was in the reading. The biologists classified them. The military applied for a permit. It was granted. They did what soldiers do. All the correct protocols were followed. This just seems like a standard clerical error. One of the humans, Philippe from French Mars, according to his name tag, stated looking for an answer to his unasked question. Doesn't it? Dr. Ed sighed. Benevolent bureaucracy, or even benevolent bureaucrats, are rare on Earth, and even rarer in the galaxy as a whole. The professor chuckled at some joke no one else understood. The Agazid were classified as inhabiting like a B6 world, meaning that it was one of the most vicious, predatory, and dangerous worlds in the galaxy. Thus, when xenobiologists landed, they were more concerned with their own safety than doing their jobs properly. When they encountered what could have been intelligent life, they wrote it off as low sapient, because what else could evolve in such a hellhole? And nobody bothered to follow up. Dr. Ed laughed a bitter laugh. Never mind a follow-up, nobody bothered to go over the initial survey reports until the atrocities came to light. When the initial survey report was released to the galaxy at large, the Caliph applied to use the world as a training ground for their military. An undesirable world, inhabited by undesirables in a relatively far-flung region of the galaxy. Dr. Ed trailed off to survey the class. The Caliph students were largely uncomfortable. Those who knew what was coming were trying to repress their instinct to run and hide. A few remained defiant, until their Death World professor showed his teeth. The humans. They had read enough of their own history to know how this lecture was going to end, and Philippe from French Mars felt like an idiot. Good. Their application was quickly granted, and their military set up a station in orbit to facilitate the planet-side training. Kaleth soldiers quickly encountered the Agazid and, if their logs are to be believed, enjoying using them as practice, given their natural ferocity, cunning, and use of primitive tactics. Shouldn't. Yes. Dr. Ed cut the student off, his voice hard enough to cut raw steel, causing the student to recoil. It should have tipped the Kaleth off to their intelligence. It should have caused a evaluation, but they didn't feel obliged to concern themselves with a savage race. So what if they were intelligent? The survey had shown them to lack true sapience. The learned and trustworthy xenobiologists had classified them as such. Their hands were clean. Besides, they were just soldiers who were just following orders. Professor Ed stopped himself before his lecture turned into a rant, not to mention that, even if anyone suspected that the Agazid were intelligent, most militaries will not forego the opportunity to train against Deathworlders if they can do so in relative safety. So if the military wasn't going to do spearhead a re-evaluation, it would have fallen on politicians to step in. But why would they? The world wasn't inhabited by anyone useful or by the right kind of species. To the political class, it wasn't worth the possible blowback or political capital. Much better to apologize after the fact, pass the blame back to the military, and build a memorial than to risk one's career trying to stop something useful. The final hope for the Agazid lay with civil society. Now, it is important to acknowledge the realities of the universe before we continue. He paused to watch his students and their reactions. Nothing major. Good. 9 in 10 sapient species evolve on garden worlds, paradise worlds, gardens of Eden, as the humans call them. This means that the perceived default sapient is a 2 to 6-legged flightless, herding herbivore that evolved to live either exclusively or primarily on land. These species evolved on worlds that were either largely or completely devoid of large predators and lacked parasitic life forms, including most viruses or bacteria. Given these non-competitive, comfortable environments, most species prefer to eschew actual physical violence in favor of displays of power and force if things escalate that far. From their perspective, wars where you actually use weapons are needlessly destructive and only used as a last resort or preemptively when success is guaranteed. This stands in stark contrast to the remaining 10% of life in the galaxy, species that evolved on either primarily or exclusively carnivorous worlds. On those worlds, life lives not in competition so much as in a continuous state of conflict. Among higher-order creatures, this process is driven more by instinct and the pursuit of glory, which in turn allows social advancement, than the need to feed. Violence is exceptionally commonplace, and shows of force are usually only precursors to the actual use of force. Additionally, moderate to high Category B planets are dominated by obligate carnivores as opposed to omnivores. Thus they tend towards low populations of highly aggressive individuals who, most importantly, have the capacity to act on their tendencies. Now, who wants to tell me which adjectives are frequently used to describe my kind among civil society? The silence was deafening. The herbivores who dominated the room sat in nervous silence, perhaps aware of the fact that the few Deathworlders present could kill many of them with little or no effort, and they were loath to provoke them in such tight quarters. Dr. Ed laughed. At least they knew when to keep silent. Even the common name for my people's category of world should tip you all off as to how we're viewed by the larger galaxy. lower death worlders, though most people drop the lower and lesser and simply call us death worlders. There are also savage death worlds, even more vicious and horrible than lesser death worlds. Lesser or lower were frequently used due to cast doubts on our intelligence. In modern society that has fallen from use as people generally assume that death worlders are second tier at best, while savage death worlders are more akin to beasts of burden than sapients. Other common adjectives are stupid, aggressive, violent, destructive, untrustworthy, lazy, disease-ridden, and other delightful variations on the theme. Unfortunately, given that species higher up the food chain tend towards lower overall populations, and the fact that herbivorous species outnumber carnivorous ones almost 10 to 1 to begin with, means that death worlders have been unable to muster the political capital to change our reputations. Because they're accurate. A student couldn't help but mutter, in what was, for him, a low voice, but to the 9 predators in the hall he might as well have shouted, "Personal beliefs, dogmas, and opinion have neither place nor bearing on our work. If you can't accept that, leave." I lived on Earth for 2 decades. I've heard slurs more creative than anything you could ever come up with. Dr. Ed gestured to the door for a second time and let the silence drag on for a moment before continuing. So when considering the muted response of Caleth civil society during the Agazid affair, we also have to consider how they were viewed by said civil society. They were a technologically backwards, death-worlder species of questionable sapience, whose existence had barely warranted a few lines on a slow news day. As such, civil society, if it was even aware of the question of their sapience, was probably not going to act in their defense when there were so many other things with which to fill their time. On top of that, many would have been willing to tolerate combat training, given how close their homeworld is to the hinge of empires. This is compounded by the fact that one of them is a death-worlder empire. By the time the killings ended, over 80% of the Agazid had been exterminated. They lost much of their technological and social progress, and have regressed from bronze and iron tribal confederations to primitive, isolated, xenophobic clans. It will be centuries at the earliest before they join the galactic community, if ever. And frankly, most of our field is leaning towards half a millennium. That is why our work is so important. If we do our jobs properly, thoroughly, and well, we play a central role in expanding our understanding of life in our galaxy and ensuring that all species, no matter their origins, can find a place in the larger galactic whole. However, if done poorly, we simply serve a source for bigots and racists to legitimize their views. If corrupted, we become tools for whatever ends our paymasters have envisioned. If done maliciously, we may become complicit in genocide and the destruction of whole species and cultures. He surveyed his students, who looked like the immature students they were. They heard his lecture. They heard his speech. They heard his words. But they didn't understand. They couldn't. But they would. In this hall they would grow into adults, or they would cry to a counselor. Dr. Ed had said as much in his course outline. They hadn't believed it then, but they would, because everyone knew that seeing was crucial to believing. He would make them see. All of you are wondering, I'm sure, what I plan to say now. Now that my speech about responsibility, one you've heard 1,000 times from your parents, is done. He smiled. He had too many teeth to make his smile anything more than a gruesome pantomime of the human variety. The projectors that had sat dormant came to life. It was one thing for students to be told that their choices might lead to genocide. It was quite another to be confronted with that reality. and the hall had been specially outfitted with the best projectors money could buy. And some projectors that money this couldn't. It paid to have friends on Earth and Ruhr Thor who would lend advanced tech to friends under the auspices of field testing. Bodies. The Agazid were a bipedal species that could drop to all fours. This allowed them to sprint at high speeds and granted them considerable acrobatic ability for their size. Their bodies were covered in hard plates, giving them a modicum of natural armor, while curved horns and thicker plates covered their head, preventing them from wearing helmets. Instead, they opted for decorated bronze masks and additional layers of bronze and iron armor over their bodies. Iron and bronze that had been punched through by guns. Lasers and plasma had done their deadly duty and cut the Agazid down like so many stalks of grain. The Kaleth had carried out their training missions like professionals inflicting fatal injuries without prejudice or remorse. As you can see, at this point, the Kaleth were still acting like soldiers and not blood-crazed lunatics. That changed shortly after the construction of the orbital station and the arrival of more experienced officers. The images and video clips that followed showed changes, not in the Agazid, who still wore bronze and iron now, with a few scraps of Kaleth armor. Their ability to scavenge Kaleth armor was a testament to their natural skills, given that they had little else to rely on. The changes that the audio and video revealed were in the Kaleth and how they acted. Gone were the precise, lethal wounds inflicted from a safe distance. In their place were deep gouges inflicted by blades, the crushing impacts of blunt force weapons, and the gruesome burns of point-blank plasma. Where there was previously the efficient silence of a military force, broken only by commands, there was now the raucous noise of a frontier mercenary band. On top of that, sometimes, in some clips, they could hear how the Agazid were killed, slowly, painfully, and with obvious relish. What prompted this change? Dr. Ed asked. Undisciplined recruits? Someone hazarded. A good guess, but no. Additional and more experienced officers had arrived with the construction of the orbital station. Dr. Ed repeated, I'd think hand-to-hand, and close quarters is valuable, especially on ships. The other human ventured, but... He shook his head, replaying the audio and video in his mind. This must have started out as proper training, and these final sections are from later when something changed. Excellent. But what prompted the change? The professor prodded. I'd have guessed a breakdown in discipline from shitty officers who couldn't, or probably wouldn't, keep their soldiers in line. You're right in that it did start as routine combat training, exactly for boarding maneuvers. But the escalation was due to two separate factors. The first pair were boredom and indifference. Threats to ground stations kept soldiers constantly on guard and on edge. They didn't have time or energy to screw around. Once they got eyes in the sky and an orbital station, it became possible for the soldiers on the ground to relax. They knew there was no real threat. The primitive tactics that were occasionally effective in an ambush were useless when the Kaleth could see them coming from, literally, miles away. Bored soldiers quickly become stupid, and they promptly began competing with each other, which in this case took the form of increasingly stupid engagements with the Agazid. The second reason was for revenge. Deathworlders don't have their reputation for nothing, and many of the officers who were experienced had earned that experience in piracy suppression campaigns and border skirmishes. It follows then, and deployment records back this up, that many of the friends and soldiers they had lost were to Deathworlder pirates and mercenaries. They couldn't avenge or take blood from the pirates themselves. But the Agazid were functional stand-ins, and when they realized that there was little to no risk of a reprimand from higher powers. Dr. Ed shrugged. The still frame spoke for him. This second phase lasted about 7 years. Second phase, it gets worse. A Capra, descended from mountain stock if appearances were anything to go by, asked, his fur clinging tightly to his body, distressed. He should be. Dr. Ed looked at him with his dead eyes. Much. The standard contract for a Calath soldier is about 7 standard years, give or take a few months. Some of them went home with fantastical stories, and even more fantastic trophies. This time, Dr. Ed didn't rely on a hologram. He lifted a case onto the oversized lectern and lifted the cloth. This Agazid skull was acquired by a Calath sergeant during the 4th year of operations here. He moved another crate into position. We have tusks and horns, which were occasionally kept whole, but usually made into decorative weapons or gun stocks. And finally, he lifted a glass jar and placed it atop the skull case. This is an Agazid heart, which, when properly broken down, can improve many outward signs of aging. Trophy hunting. One of the humans, Mark of Terra, whispered. Exactly. Dr. Ed nodded. The vanity of the upper classes never changes. Not across time, and not across worlds. Some Agazid were killed for personal trophies as soldiers wanted to prove their bravery and strength. Some were killed for their various bits and pieces that were of use to the pharmaceutical industry, or more commonly, miracle cure peddlers. But those were the lucky ones. They generally died quickly, given how dangerous a species they were, and how much of a risk it was to leave them alive. The unlucky ones, a Syrinx asked quietly. Records are hazy regarding exactly when this began, but... Dr. Ed paused. The unlucky ones were used for testing, weapons testing mostly, but everything from poisons to exposure to who knows what else was carried out in secret. Dr. Ed paused, shock, horror, and the most vehement kind of disbelief that only surfaces when someone's view of the universe is being directly challenged. The military no longer had to worry about the public's collective conscience, now that they too had wholly embraced the status of the Agazid as being animals. This in turn meant that they no longer had to bother with the veneer of deniability. Calath leaders rationalized testing on the Agazid, the same way immoral savages always have. The greater good. It was for the greater good that Agazid were used to test laser and plasma weaponry. It was for the greater good that the limits of Deathworlder survivability were explored. It was for the greater good that drugs and poisons were tested on them. And it was for the greater good that they were killed in the hundreds of thousands. Bullshit! A Calath student exploded to his feet, chest heaving, trapped with nowhere to run. Dr. Ed chuckled. There's one in every class. Direct your attention to the front. This is standard audio and video. I can assure you, all our weapons have been extensively tested. A Calath, presumably an officer, spoke, footsteps echoing off the cold metal. But not in combat, a human asked. He spoke one of the more heavily accented dialects. No. So that's why you're offering us such a deal. The human chuckled. Indeed. We need someone who's willing to test our weapons against a variety of targets. Varied targets. I guess that's one way of putting it. The two men arrived at a set of heavy doors, and, for a moment, the oppressive silence of the lecture hall reasserted itself. What? The fuck? The human breathed, and the student saw what he saw. The men stood at a walkway that crossed over a massive hall, divided roughly into 4, cages housing Agazid, a testing laboratory, a range, and a morgue where the dead were laid out and studied, like so many pieces of meat. As I said, the weapons have been tested extensively on animals. The human asked, though it fell like a statement that brooked no argument. Of course, sapient testing is illegal, not to mention unethical, the officer affirmed, voice smooth and steady. Indeed. Dr. Ed chuckled to himself. The predators had noticed it. The humans, too. The veiled distrust and suspicion. Nobody knew what tipped the human off to the fact that the things in the cages weren't just animals. It might have been nothing. It might have been the ethereal and inexplicable feeling that they get between their shoulder blades, or it might have been an itch on his fighting hand that ran into his trigger finger. Joachim had refused to elaborate on how he knew that something was off, and humans in general couldn't explain their gut feel in any useful way. That, Dr. Ed spoke up, as the men on screen began signing documents, was Joachim von Ross, a pirate turned privateer. The treaty protecting the Agazid has his name for his role in putting an end to the atrocity, and because humans love putting their names on things. Now prepare yourselves. I've had months. Dr. Ed waved a hand, and the lights changed to more accurately reflect the atmosphere of Algoth, the Agazid home world, though few students would appreciate the attention to detail. The humidity rose with the temperature to well above standard. Then came the sounds, but where there should have been the vibrant cacophony of tropical life, there were only a few cries and the omnipresent buzzing of insects. Some students snickered, while others sat in guarded silence, unwilling to risk the chalk. The smart ones saw the syrinx instinctively puff their feathers. The warning call they heard might not have been a syrinx, but among avian species, warning calls were universally understood. The smell followed. Dr. Ed had spent months working with humans to concoct the right fragrance. The smell of organic rot and decay, as well as that of the fresh growth and blooming flora that permeates any jungle. Then they were hit by the stench of fear, urine, feces, and a touch of sweat, and finally the cloying richness of dead flesh, already decomposing in the sweltering heat, mixing the ferric stench of blood. Most of the students were retching. Some had already vomited. A few proud fools had neglected to take a sick bag, further contributing to the horrific miasma that filled the hall. Then came the projection to match, a village untouched by flame, peaceful, until you saw the bodies. The students might not have known what a dead Agazid child looked like before, but they did now. They might not have known what a person butchered for its trophies looked like before, but they did now. They might not have known what a tortured form looked like before, but they did now. They might have been children before, but they weren't anymore. The scene in front of them wasn't a statistic, wasn't an abstract from a textbook. This was the sight, the smell, the sound of murder, of genocide. Son of a bitch. The voice of Joachim von Ross from before cut through the retching that filled the hall and paralyzed even those students who had thought to flee. What the fuck? Jesus! Shit! Bastards! What the sweet hell? God have mercy. It continued, frame after frame, as the human soldiers moved silently through the ravaged village, only breaking the jungle sounds to swear at a particularly grisly scene. Parents shielding their children, elders too old to fight, beaten and left to bleed out, bodies crushed by armored vehicles, bodies, corpse after corpse, each new dwelling holding a few more mangled and desecrated corpses. Only when the last room was cleared, holding what must have been the very young. Only once the humans returned to the center of the village, where boot prints and the trails left by feet being dragged through the dirt ended where the vehicle tracks began, did the projectors cut. It was a mercy to be torn from a forgotten village on Algoth, and deposited back in Hall 47, where the only proof of what they had seen was the smell of vomit, but that too was processed by the ventilation systems until all they were left with were their maelstroms in their minds. Those of you who need to, clean yourselves up. I will continue. Many left on shaking legs, eyes dazed, still trying to process what they had seen. Only a single handful would return. Some stayed, and to those Dr. Ed would dedicate his time without reserve, because they would confront whatever came at them with open eyes. They had offered sufficient proof of that. 3 days after this footage was taken, Joachim von Ross and his crew stormed the training facility and slaughtered the soldiers on the planet. They then seized the orbital station and held the crew hostage. 4 days later, and 30 minutes after the arrival of the human Titan fleet around the Kaleth homeworld, and threats from every Death World species as well as Karalis High Command, the Kaleth, too publicly admitted to what they had been doing and signed of the Von Ross Treaty, which led to the creation of Protectorate-class worlds. It was the fastest that large-scale crisis was resolved. The threat of total annihilation tends to have that effect. Dr. Ed chuckled. The Agazids still don't communicate with outsiders, save the human delegation that goes down once a quarter to deliver supplies and data packets, and their population will likely remain depressed for several centuries. Dr. Ed shook his head. What you just saw was our work, stretched to its most horrific extreme. We classify, quantify, and qualify all life in the galaxy. We study, analyze, process, and once all is said and done, we are the ones that assign life its final designation. We are the final arbiters of the realities which all newly discovered life will face. We determine how long and hard their road to acceptance will be. We are the ones who can, through biased and research and deceptive findings, either build up stereotypes to confirm what everyone knows. We can lend legitimacy to acts of genocide and become willing pawns in campaigns of bigotry and prejudice that produce only pain and suffering on an unimaginable scale. Or we can stand for truth in whatever form it may take. Truth is not always be pretty. It may not always be what we want to see, nor what we had hoped to find. But it will ensure that when the people of tomorrow fix their gaze upon us, that we can look back, unflinching. It is truth above all else that we must pursue, for it is truth, above all else, that will set our souls, if not our hearts, at ease. Dr. Ed sighed. Was it a clerical error? Was this? The projectors came on. A still image. A clerical error. He let his eyes wander across the hall, across the students, who would likely never see things the same way. The humans were remarkably unaffected. It wasn't a surprise. They were crucible, forged after all. And to them, this was nothing new. But the rest, many of them would skip the rest of the day. They would go home and cry. They would call their mothers and their siblings. They would demand to know why. Why we were so cruel. Why we were so base. Why there was still evil in a time of plenty. Even the Deathworlders, like him, wouldn't be unaffected. They might drink more than the others, and once deep in their cups, they would reach out to their trainers and masters and, slowly, with halting words and broken sentences, they would try to express the pain they had seen, pain not their own. They would ask question, to which their all-knowing masters would only offer silence. The question of a clerical error hung in the air, where Dr. Ed decided to leave it. He let his gaze wander over his class as they shuffled out, some still covered in sick. It had been, and he hoped they would agree with him in the future, for the best. The children of today must grow to be the beacons of tomorrow, and he would weather whatever the administration threw at him to ensure that they did. He had, after all, suffered much, much worse in pursuit of far less.